Alexander Hale's polished black sedan rolled to a stop in front of the humble brick building of St. Margaret's Orphanage. The place was a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers and luxurious offices where he spent most of his days. The billionaire, known for his ruthless business tactics and cold demeanor, rarely ventured into places like this. But today was different. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and scanned the surroundings with disinterest. This visit was nothing more than a calculated move, a donation to boost his public image after the latest scandal involving one of his many companies. His PR team had insisted on this appearance, portraying it as an act of benevolence. For Alexander, it was just another transaction. The orphanage director, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted him at the entrance. "Mr. Hale, it's an honor to have you here. The children are very excited about your visit." Alexander forced a smile, nodding curtly. "I'm glad to be here," he replied, his voice devoid of warmth. His eyes drifted to the group of children playing in the courtyard, all of them blissfully unaware of who he was or why he was there. As they walked through the orphanage, the director explained the work they did, the struggles they faced, and how much his donation would help. Alexander listened with half an ear, his mind elsewhere, already calculating the PR value of this visit. It wasn't until they reached the common room that something caught his attention. In the corner, sitting alone on a worn-out rug, was a young boy no older than 6, playing quietly with a small, battered toy car. There was something about the boy's solitude, the way he seemed detached from the other children, that drew Alexander's gaze. He found himself walking towards the boy, the director's voice fading into the background. The boy didn't look up as Alexander approached, too engrossed in guiding the toy car along imaginary roads. Alexander knelt down, his expensive shoes creaking on the old floorboards, and watched the boy silently for a moment. The toy car was old and worn, its once vibrant paint chipped away, revealing the dull metal beneath. But what made Alexander's breath catch in his throat was the unmistakable detail: a small, barely visible scratch in the shape of a star on the roof of the car. It was a scratch he knew all too well. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing the toy lightly. The boy finally looked up, his large brown eyes meeting Alexander's with a mix of curiosity and indifference. But Alexander wasn't looking at the boy anymore. His focus was entirely on the car. "This car?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, his mind racing. Memories he had buried deep, locked away in the darkest corners of his heart, came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked him off balance. This car had belonged to his son, his only child, who had disappeared without a trace 3 years ago. He could still remember the day his son, Evan, had run to him, holding the toy car in his small hands, excited to show off the new scratch he had made while playing. Alexander had scolded him then, annoyed at the imperfection, but now, that very scratch was the only thing grounding him to the present moment. As the terrifying realization began to sink in. "Where did you get this car?" Alexander asked, his voice more forceful than he intended. The boy flinched at the sudden change in his tone, instinctively clutching the car to his chest as if fearing it would be taken away. The director, noticing the change in Alexander's demeanor, hurried over. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hale?" Alexander ignored her, his focus solely on the boy. "Please, where did you get this car?" he repeated, this time trying to soften his voice. The boy hesitated, glancing up at the director for reassurance. When she nodded, he spoke quietly. "It was here when I came. I don't know where it's from." Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He felt as though the ground was slipping away beneath him. This couldn't be a coincidence. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "I need to speak to you," Alexander said, standing up abruptly and addressing the director with an intensity that made her take a step back. "In private?" The director nodded, her expression shifting from concern to a quiet understanding. "Of course, Mr. Hale. This way." As they walked towards her office, Alexander's mind was in turmoil. This visit, meant to be nothing more than a shallow PR stunt, had suddenly turned into something much darker, something personal. He could feel the walls closing in as the past he had tried so hard to forget came rushing back, threatening to unravel everything. And at the center of it all was the boy and the small, battered toy car. relic of a life Alexander thought he had lost forever. The director's office was dimly lit, the afternoon sun filtering through the dusty blinds in thin streaks. Alexander stood by the window, his back to the director as he tried to steady his breathing. The boy's face and the toy car were etched into his mind like a ghost from the past that refused to fade. "Mr. Hale," the director's voice was cautious, laced with the kind of concern people used when dealing with someone on the edge. "You seem troubled. Did something about that boy upset you?" Alexander turned slowly, his eyes sharp and intense. "I need to know everything about him. His name, where he came from, how long he's been here, everything." The director blinked, taken aback by the urgency in his tone. "That's quite an unusual request. May I ask why you're so interested in him?" Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. He knew he had to be careful. Revealing too much too soon could backfire, and he didn't trust anyone with the information swirling in his mind. "Not yet. Let's just say I have a personal interest. Can you tell me what you know?" The director hesitated for a moment before walking over to her desk and opening a worn leather file folder. "His name is Nathan," she began, glancing at a few documents. "He was brought here about a year ago by social services. They found him wandering alone on the streets, confused and malnourished. No one came forward to claim him, and he hasn't talked much about where he came from or his family." Alexander's jaw tightened. "So, you don't know anything about his past? Where he lived before, who his parents are?" She shook her head sadly. "No. We've tried to get him to open up, but he's very closed off, like he's afraid to remember. Sometimes, children who go through trauma build walls around certain memories, and breaking through those walls takes time, sometimes years." A shiver ran down Alexander's spine. Could it really be possible? Could this child somehow be connected to Evan, his missing son? Every logical bone in his body screamed that it was impossible, that this was just a twisted coincidence. But the emotional part of him, the part that had been tormented by guilt and regret for years, couldn't let it go. "What about the toy car?" Alexander asked, trying to mask the desperation in his voice. "You said it was here when he arrived. Do you know where it came from?" The director furrowed her brow. "I believe it was with him when social services found him. It was the only possession he had. We didn't think much of it, just another child holding onto a small comfort item in a scary world." Alexander felt his chest tighten as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, though the picture they formed was still shrouded in shadows. If that car was truly his son's, then someone out there knew where Evan had been and why he disappeared. But who? And why would they abandon this boy with a link to his past? "I need to speak with him again," Alexander said abruptly. "Alone." The director's expression shifted from concern to uncertainty. "Mr. Hale, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Nathan is." "Please," Alexander cut in, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "I just need a few minutes." There was a long pause before the director finally sighed and nodded. "All right, but please, be gentle with him. He's been through a lot." Alexander didn't respond. His mind was already racing, formulating questions, trying to untangle the web of mysteries that seemed to be closing in around him. Minutes later, he was back in the common room where the children were playing. The atmosphere was warm and lively, but Alexander's focus was locked on the small figure still sitting alone in the corner, gripping that old toy car as if it were a lifeline. Alexander approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Nathan," he said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level with the boy. Nathan's gaze remained fixed on the floor, his grip on the toy tightening as Alexander drew closer. "What's your name, really?" Alexander asked, his voice gentle but probing. The boy looked up this time, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "It's Nathan," he whispered. "Who gave you that car?" Alexander asked, inching closer. "Did someone special give it to you?" Nathan's lip quivered as he shook his head, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, that made Alexander's heart pound. "Do you remember where you lived before you came here? A house, or maybe someone who took care of you?" Alexander's questions were rapid now, his desperation slipping through. Nathan's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. "I don't want to talk about it," he muttered, his voice trembling. Alexander knew he was pushing too hard, but he couldn't stop himself. "Please, Nathan, it's important. I can help you, but I need to know the truth." The boy's face crumpled, and he hugged the toy car to his chest, tears welling up in his eyes. "He told me not to talk about it," he whimpered. "He said bad things would happen if I told." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "Who told you that? Nathan, who are you afraid of?" But Nathan shut down completely, his eyes squeezing shut as he rocked back and forth, murmuring, I can't. The director rushed over, sensing the distress, and placed a comforting hand on Nathan's shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart. You don't have to say anything." Alexander stood, frustration and helplessness boiling inside him. He had hoped for more, some breakthrough that would give him the answers he needed. But instead, all he had were more questions, more shadows creeping into his mind. "I'm sorry," the director said quietly, guiding Nathan away. "He's been like this since he arrived. Whoever he's afraid of, it's deep-rooted. We've tried to get him to talk to a therapist, but he refuses." As Nathan was led away, Alexander's gaze lingered on the boy until he disappeared down the hallway. He had to find out who this he was, the person Nathan feared, the one who held the key to everything. Alexander turned back to the director. "I want to see his file. Every document you have on him." The director frowned. "Mr. Hale, those records are confidential. I can't just—" "I'll double the donation," Alexander interrupted coldly. "Whatever it takes." Her reluctance wavered for a moment, but then she nodded. "Give me a few minutes." As she walked away to retrieve the file, Alexander's mind raced. He was standing at the edge of something dark and unknown, but he knew he couldn't back away now. There were secrets buried here, and he was determined to unearth them, no matter the cost. The file was thicker than Alexander expected. When the director handed it to him, she hesitated, as if questioning whether she was making the right decision. But one glance at Alexander's cold, determined expression was enough to silence her doubts. He took the file and retreated to a quiet corner, his heart thudding in anticipation as he opened it. The first few pages were basic, a summary of Nathan's physical condition when he arrived, notes from social workers, a few brief observations about his behavior. But buried beneath the medical reports and intake forms were the details Alexander was really searching for. The events surrounding how Nathan was found. His eyes scanned the documents rapidly. Discovered in an alley near the east side of town, found clutching a toy car and a piece of paper with an illegible address. Appeared malnourished and disoriented. No identification. Unable to recall details about his family or home. Alexander's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. The details were frustratingly vague, offering little more than the fact that Nathan had been wandering alone before being brought to the orphanage. But there was something about the location that nagged at him, a faint recollection buried in the recesses of his mind. The east side of town was a notorious area, home to crime rings and shadowy deals conducted under the cover of night. It was the kind of place Alexander had avoided in recent years, especially after turning his back on some of his more dubious business connections. But he knew enough about that world to recognize that if Nathan had been found there, it was no coincidence. His eyes landed on a handwritten note at the bottom of the page. Witness statement. An older man, possibly homeless, claimed to have seen Nathan with a dangerous-looking man days before he was found. The description of the man was unclear, but the witness mentioned a distinctive scar running down the side of his face. A scar. Alexander's blood ran cold. He knew someone with a scar like that. A man he'd crossed paths with years ago during a deal that went south. The man's name was Vaughn, and he was infamous for his brutal methods and loyalty to the highest bidder. Vaughn had vanished off the radar around the time Evan disappeared, and Alexander had never been able to find out what happened to him. Could it be that Vaughn was somehow involved with Nathan? Before he could dwell on the thought further, the director's voice cut through his focus. "Mr. Hale, did you find anything helpful?" Alexander looked up, carefully masking the turmoil brewing inside him. "Perhaps. I need to follow up on a few things." He closed the file, handing it back with a tight smile. "Thank you for your cooperation. I'll make sure the orphanage gets more than what I initially pledged." The director nodded, though concern still lingered in her eyes. I just hope whatever you're looking into doesn't cause more harm than good. Alexander's expression hardened. I'm doing what needs to be done. With that, he left the office, the wheels in his mind turning at full speed. He needed to get answers, and he knew exactly where to start. That night, the sleek black sedan pulled into a dimly lit parking lot on the outskirts of town. The neon lights from a rundown bar flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. Alexander stepped out of the car, his senses heightened by the tension that hung in the air. This was the kind of place where secrets were sold and danger lurked in every corner. He pushed through the bar's creaky door, greeted by a stale cloud of cigarette smoke and the murmur of low conversations. Eyes turned to him briefly before dismissing him as just another stranger passing through. But Alexander knew better than to be careless. He approached the bar, locking eyes with the bartender, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, not bothering to hide his suspicion. "Information," Alexander said flatly. He slid a $100 bill across the counter. "I'm looking for someone. Name's Vaughn. I heard he's been seen around these parts." The bartender's eyes flicked to the cash before he smirked. "A lot of people come through here asking questions. Answers don't come cheap." Alexander didn't blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of bills, and slapped it onto the counter. "I'm not here to haggle. I need to know if Vaughn's still operating in this area." The bartender eyed the money, then leaned in closer. "Vaughn, yeah, he's been seen around, but he's a ghost. Comes and goes, leaves no trace. Last I heard, he's been laying low at an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Word is he's running something shady out of there. If you're smart, you'll stay away." "I'll take my chances," Alexander muttered, pocketing the remaining cash before heading out. As he exited the bar, he felt a knot of unease twist in his gut. Confronting Vaughn was a risk, but it was one he had to take. If Vaughn had anything to do with Nathan, or worse, Evan, Alexander needed to find out. The night grew darker as Alexander made his way to the docks, the distant hum of the city fading into the cold silence of the waterfront. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted walls and broken windows giving it an air of decay and abandonment. But Alexander knew better than to be fooled by appearances. If Vaughn was there, the place would be heavily guarded. He parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, sticking to the shadows. As he neared the building, he spotted movement, two men standing guard near the entrance, their eyes scanning the area. They were armed, and judging by their stance, they weren't amateurs. Alexander crouched behind a stack of shipping crates, weighing his options. He couldn't afford to get caught. If Vaughn got wind of him before he could gather any information, this lead would go cold, and he might lose his only chance at uncovering the truth. A sudden rustling sound behind him made him freeze. He whipped around, prepared to confront whoever had snuck up on him. But instead of an attacker, he found himself staring at a figure emerging from the darkness. A man with a scar running down the side of his face. Vaughn. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The air crackled with tension as the past came crashing back like a tidal wave. Vaughn's lips curled into a twisted smile, his hand hovering near his weapon. Well, if it isn't Alexander Hale," Vaughn drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "Didn't expect to see you crawling around these parts. Looking for something? Or should I say someone?" Alexander's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained steely. "You know why I'm here, Vaughn. I want answers. And if you don't give them to me willingly, I'll make sure you regret it." Vaughn chuckled, his smile widening. "You're playing a dangerous game, Hale. But if it's answers you want, you'd better be ready for what comes next. Because this goes deeper than you think." Alexander's grip tightened. He was on the brink of uncovering something dark, something that would force him to confront not only the mystery behind Nathan and Evan, but also the monsters lurking in his own past. Vaughn's smile was a jagged scar across his face, a reminder of every deal gone wrong, every betrayal that still haunted Alexander. The two men stood in tense silence, neither willing to make the first move. The night air was thick with anticipation, the distant echo of waves crashing against the docks providing the only backdrop to their confrontation. Alexander's mind raced. He knew Vaughn was dangerous, a man with no loyalties except to his own survival. The scar running down the side of his face was a testament to how ruthless he could be when cornered. But Alexander also knew this was his best chance to get the answers he so desperately needed. Answers that could lead him to the truth about Evan's disappearance and the mysterious boy, Nathan. "Let's cut the games, Vaughn," Alexander said, his voice cold and steady. "You have information I need. If you tell me what I want to know, we both walk away. If you don't, I'll make sure you never operate in this city again." Vaughn's eyes narrowed, sizing up the billionaire standing in front of him. "You think you can intimidate me, Hale? I'm not one of those corporate lackeys you're used to bullying. But I'll give you credit. You've got guts showing up here alone." He took a step closer, his hand never straying far from his weapon. "But I don't think you're ready for the answers you're looking for. Sometimes, the truth is uglier than the lies we tell ourselves." "I'm not interested in riddles, Vaughn," Alexander snapped, his patience wearing thin. 3 years ago, my son disappeared. You were in the picture back then, and now, I find a boy with his toy car. A boy who's terrified to talk about where he came from. You know something, and you're going to tell me." Vaughn's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "You're still hung up on that, huh? I thought you'd buried that part of your life. Guess some ghosts don't stay dead." Alexander's chest tightened as the weight of Vaughn's words hung in the air. "Where is he, Vaughn? What happened to my son?" Vaughn tilted his head, as if considering whether to tell Alexander what he wanted to know. "You always did like to think you were in control, didn't you? But the truth is, Hale, you're just as lost as the rest of us when it comes to this. You want to know where your son is? You'll have to dig deeper than you're prepared for. But since you're so determined, I'll make you a deal." Alexander's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of deal?" Vaughn chuckled darkly. "Information isn't free, especially when it's this valuable. I'll tell you what I know about your son. And that kid, Nathan. But in return, you're going to do something for me." Alexander knew better than to trust Vaughn. Deals with him always came with strings attached, and those strings had a way of wrapping around your throat. But he was out of options. He couldn't walk away without knowing more. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice edged with caution. Vaughn's smile returned, this time colder, more calculating. "There's a shipment coming into the docks tomorrow night. Weapons, cash, you name it, high stakes. I've got some buyers lined up, but the whole thing's been compromised. Someone tipped off the feds, and now I need a way to keep them distracted long enough to get the goods out. That's where you come in." Alexander's stomach churned. He had left that life behind years ago. No more dirty deals, no more shady business. But now, the past was clawing its way back, forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he'd buried. If he agreed to this, he'd be stepping back into a world he had worked hard to escape. "What exactly are you asking?" Alexander's voice was laced with reluctance. "I need you to use your connections, pull some strings, make some calls. Get the feds looking the other way while I handle the drop. You do that, and I'll give you what you want. The location, the names, everything. But cross me, and this conversation never happened." Alexander's mind whirled as he considered the implications. This was dangerous territory, both legally and morally. But every fiber of his being screamed that this was the only way forward. The only way to get closer to finding out what really happened to Evan, and to understand why this boy, Nathan, was so important. "Fine," Alexander said through gritted teeth. "I'll do it. But if you double-cross me, Vaughn, I'll make sure it's the last mistake you ever make." Vaughn's grin widened, pleased with the outcome. Now, that's the Hale I remember. Always willing to get his hands dirty when it really matters. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, handing it to Alexander. "This is the address where you can find me after the job's done. You'll get your answers there. But remember, no tricks. You hold up your end, and I'll hold up mine." Alexander took the paper without a word, tucking it into his pocket. He didn't trust Vaughn, not for a second, but he couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. He was too close, and the stakes were too high. As Vaughn turned to leave, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Oh, and one last thing, Hale. When you do find out the truth, make sure you're ready for it. Sometimes, the answers you dig up aren't the ones you're hoping for." With that, Vaughn disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and the suffocating weight of the deal he had just made. The echoes of Vaughn's words lingered in the cold night air, a grim reminder that the path he was on was leading him deeper into the darkness. Alexander stood there for a moment, staring at the warehouse, trying to push back the flood of doubt creeping into his mind. He had already crossed a line, and there was no going back now. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next steps. Tomorrow, he would have to maneuver through old connections, bend the rules, and dive back into a world he had hoped to leave behind. Because in this twisted game, the truth was the only prize that mattered, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. The morning light filtered through the high-rise windows of Alexander's office, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. He sat at his desk, fingers steepled, staring blankly at the cityscape beyond. The bustling world outside felt distant, disconnected from the storm brewing within him. He had made a decision last night, a dangerous one that could unravel everything he had built. But as the weight of his commitment settled over him, he knew there was no turning back. Vaughn had information he needed, and the only way to get it was to dive headfirst into the dark world he had once ruled. Alexander reached for the phone, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind. He had been out of the game for years, but the contacts were still there, dormant but not forgotten. He dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time, one that belonged to a man who owed him more than a few favors. The line rang once, twice, before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, it's Hale," Alexander said, his voice cold and controlled. "I need to talk to you. Now." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low chuckle. "Hale? It's been a while. Thought you went straight. What brings you back to the land of the living?" Alexander's grip tightened on the receiver. "I don't have time for pleasantries. I need you to run interference on a Fed operation. There's a shipment coming into the docks tonight, and I need their eyes somewhere else." The man on the other end, known simply as Lynch, let out a long whistle. "You don't ask for small favors, do you? That's a tall order, even for you." "I'll make it worth your while," Alexander replied, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "You pull this off, and you'll have my full backing on any future ventures. No questions asked." Lynch was silent for a moment, considering the offer. "All right," he finally said, his tone serious. "I'll set up a diversion, something that'll keep the feds busy for a good few hours. But you better make sure this deal of yours is worth it. I'm not risking my neck for nothing." "It's worth it," Alexander assured him. "You'll hear from me when it's done." He hung up without waiting for a response, his mind already moving on to the next step. He had put the wheels in motion, but now came the hard part, waiting. Alexander wasn't used to being idle, especially not when the stakes were this high. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity, the tension building as the day stretched on. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing old files, refreshing his memory on the players involved in the underworld he had once dominated. Faces, names, deals. Each one was a thread in the intricate web of power and deceit that had defined his life for so long. It was a world he had tried to leave behind, but now it was pulling him back in with a vengeance. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the city, Alexander received the confirmation he was waiting for. A brief, coded message on his phone from Lynch. "It's done. Your window is open." Alexander took a deep breath, pushing away the lingering doubts. He had to see this through. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the chill of the evening air sharp against his skin as he made his way to the docks. The docks were a hive of activity when Alexander arrived, but the energy was subdued, the kind that came with knowing something was about to go down. He parked his car in the shadows, away from the main road, and approached the warehouse Vaughn had mentioned. True to Lynch's word, there was no sign of the feds. The area was clear, but the tension was palpable. Alexander could feel eyes on him as he walked, hidden figures watching from the darkness, waiting to see if he would fulfill his part of the bargain. He reached the warehouse door, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and decay. Dim lights flickered from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the stacks of crates and rusted machinery. Vaughn was waiting for him in the center of the room, flanked by two heavily armed men. His scarred face twisted into a grin as Alexander approached. "Right on time," Vaughn drawled, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "I knew you'd come through." Alexander ignored the taunt, his gaze locked on Vaughn. "I did my part. Now it's your turn." Vaughn motioned for his men to step back, giving them a silent signal to stay alert but not intervene. "Of course," he said smoothly, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small, worn notebook and tossed it to Alexander. "Everything you need to know is in there. Addresses, names, connections. It's all there." Alexander caught the notebook, his pulse quickening. This was it, the key to finding out what had happened to Evan, to understanding who Nathan really was. But as he flipped it open, a wave of unease washed over him. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, some in Vaughn's handwriting, others in a script he didn't recognize. It was a mess of information, but the pieces were there, waiting to be put together. Vaughn watched him closely, a smirk playing on his lips. "You're getting what you wanted, Hale. But like I said before, be careful what you dig up. Some things are better left buried." Alexander's jaw tightened as he skimmed through the notes. One name stood out, circled multiple times: Rathburn. It was a name Alexander hadn't heard in years, but it sent a chill down his spine. Rathburn had been a silent partner in several of Alexander's old deals, a man who thrived in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. If Rathburn was involved, it meant the situation was even more dangerous than he'd feared. "What does Rathburn have to do with this?" Alexander demanded, his eyes snapping up to meet Vaughn's. Vaughn's expression darkened. "He's the one who started all this. The boy, your son. It's all tied to him. Rathburn's been working on something big, something that goes way beyond what you or I could have imagined. You want answers, Hale? You're going to have to face him." Alexander's stomach twisted as the pieces began to fall into place. Rathburn was a ghost, a man whose influence was felt but never seen. If he was behind Evan's disappearance and Nathan's current situation, it meant Alexander was dealing with a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple kidnapping. "I need more than just a name," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Where can I find him?" Vaughn shrugged, his smirk returning. "You think I'd still be standing here if I knew that? Rathburn's untouchable. But there are whispers, rumors about a safe house in the old district, a place where he conducts his more personal business. You might find something there, but it's a long shot." Alexander clenched his fists, the frustration boiling inside him. He was so close, but the path ahead was fraught with danger, and there were no guarantees. Still, he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through, no matter where it led. "Keep your end of the deal," Vaughn said, breaking the tense silence. "Make sure the feds stay off my back, and we'll be square. But remember, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Alexander turned to leave, but Vaughn's voice stopped him in his tracks. "And Hale, when you find Rathburn, don't make the mistake of thinking you can outsmart him. You may have been the king of this city once, but Rathburn's in a league of his own. Watch your back." Alexander didn't respond. He walked out of the warehouse, the notebook clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing with the new information. Rathburn. The name echoed in his thoughts, a specter from his past that had come back to haunt him. Whatever game Rathburn was playing, it was clear that Alexander had just become a pawn in it. As he drove away from the docks, the city lights flickering in the distance, Alexander knew that the stakes had never been higher. He had stepped into a maze of shadows and deception, where every move could be his last. But he also knew that there was no going back. He would find Rathburn. He would uncover the truth about Evan and Nathan. And when he did, he would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. The city's old district was a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers and bustling avenues that Alexander Hale was accustomed to. Here, the streets were narrow, the buildings worn with age, and the air thick with a sense of forgotten history. This part of town had once been the heart of industry, but now it was a ghost of its former self, a maze of crumbling warehouses and abandoned factories where shadows thrived. Alexander's car rolled slowly down the empty streets, his eyes scanning the dilapidated structures for any sign of the safe house Vaughn had mentioned. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat, the name Rathburn circled in red, staring up at him like a warning. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, addresses, and scribbles that seemed to lead nowhere. But one address stood out, a warehouse at the very edge of the district, isolated from the rest, surrounded by the remnants of a once thriving industrial area. He had been circling for nearly an hour, careful not to attract attention. The old district wasn't entirely abandoned. It had become a haven for those who operated on the fringes of society, where deals were made in the dead of night and secrets were traded like currency. Alexander knew he was being watched, but he didn't let it slow him down. He had come too far to turn back now. Finally, he spotted the warehouse, a massive, hulking structure with boarded-up windows and rusted metal doors. It looked like every other decaying building in the area, but there was something about it that set it apart. The hairs on the back of Alexander's neck stood on end as he pulled up to the curb, his instinct screaming that this was the place. He killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was the point of no return. Whatever he found inside could change everything, but it could also be the end of the road for him. Rathburn was a ghost, a master of manipulation and control, and Alexander knew that facing him would be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. But the image of Evan, the son he had lost, burned in his mind, pushing him forward. He had to do this. For Evan. For the answers he had spent 3 years searching for, and for the boy, Nathan, who was inexplicably tied to it all. Alexander stepped out of the car, slipping the notebook into his coat pocket. The night air was cold, biting at his skin as he approached the warehouse. The streets were eerily silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city far beyond the old district's boundaries. He reached the rusted metal door, hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The door creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing a dark, cavernous space within. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of oil. Shafts of moonlight filtered through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The warehouse was empty, or so it seemed at first glance, but Alexander knew better. This was a place where things were hidden, where people were hidden. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The warehouse was filled with old machinery, stacks of crates, and the remnants of a time when this place had been alive with activity. But now, it was a tomb, a place where secrets were buried. Alexander's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he ventured deeper into the warehouse, his senses on high alert. He knew Rathburn wouldn't make this easy. The man was a master at setting traps, and Alexander had to be ready for anything. As he moved through the shadows, he felt a prickle of unease, like he was being watched. A sudden noise, something scraping against metal, made him freeze. He whipped around, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. The sound echoed again, this time from above. Alexander looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure moved in the shadows, perched on one of the metal beams high above. The outline was vague, but there was no mistaking the presence. Alexander's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary encounter. "Rathburn," Alexander called out, his voice steady despite the tension coiling inside him. "I know you're here. Let's end this game." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, gravelly voice responded, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Alexander Hale, I didn't think you had it in you to come this far. I'm almost impressed." The figure on the beam shifted, and Alexander could see the glint of something metallic, likely a weapon. He stayed where he was, refusing to show any sign of fear. "Where's my son?" Alexander demanded, his voice cold as steel. "Where's Evan?" The figure let out a slow, mocking laugh. "You think you're ready for that answer? You've been chasing ghosts, Hale. Evan is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that you don't even know you're part of." Alexander's fists clenched at his sides, anger boiling beneath the surface. "I don't care about your games, Rathburn. I want my son back. Where is he?" Rathburn moved, leaping down from the beam with a cat-like grace, landing silently on the concrete floor a few yards from Alexander. He was dressed in black, his face obscured by the shadows, but Alexander could feel the weight of his gaze. "You've been out of the game too long, Hale," Rathburn said, his tone almost conversational. "You've forgotten how things work in our world. You think you can just demand answers and they'll be handed to you? You're in way over your head." Alexander took a step forward, his jaw tight. "I've dealt with men like you before, Rathburn. You're not invincible. Everyone has a weakness." Rathburn chuckled softly, the sound echoing through the empty space. "Is that what you think? That you can outplay me? You've always been good at bluffing, but this time, you're not holding the cards." Alexander's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He couldn't afford to let Rathburn get inside his head. He needed to stay focused, to find the leverage that would force Rathburn to give him what he wanted. "You want your son?" Rathburn continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Then you'll have to go deeper than you ever have before. Because the truth about Evan, about what really happened, is tied to everything you thought you left behind." Alexander felt his stomach drop. The implications of Rathburn's words were clear. Evan's disappearance wasn't just a random act of violence or a simple kidnapping. It was part of something bigger, something that went all the way back to the life Alexander had tried to escape. "What do you want, Rathburn?" Alexander asked, his voice laced with barely controlled rage. "Why take Evan? Why involve a child?" Rathburn stepped closer, his face coming into view, a cold, calculating expression that sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. Evan was leverage, a means to an end. But now, he's much more than that. He's part of the future, a future you can't begin to comprehend. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as Rathburn's words sank in. This wasn't just about revenge or money. There was something else at play, something dark and twisted that Rathburn was orchestrating from the shadows. "Where is he?" Alexander demanded again, his voice shaking with fury. "Tell me where he is." Rathburn smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a wave of dread through Alexander. "He's exactly where he needs to be, Hale. And if you want to see him again, you'll have to do exactly what I say." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Rathburn had him trapped, backed into a corner with no way out. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when he was so close. "What do you want me to do?" Alexander asked, his voice low, every word laced with determination. Rathburn's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. "There's a package being delivered to the city, a package that will change everything. I need you to intercept it and bring it to me. You do that, and I'll give you your son." Alexander stared at Rathburn, his mind racing. He didn't trust him, couldn't trust him, but he had no other choice. This was the only lead he had, and if it meant getting Evan back, he was willing to do whatever it took. "Where is the package?" Alexander asked, his voice hard. Rathburn's smile widened. "I'll send you the details. But remember, Hale, if you try to double-cross me, if you even think about going to the authorities, you'll never see your son again." Alexander's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to nod. "I'll do it." "Good," Rathburn said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Then we'll be in touch. And Hale, welcome back to the game." With that, Rathburn turned and melted into the shadows, leaving Alexander alone in the cavernous warehouse, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a vice. He stood there for a long moment, the darkness closing in around him. Rathburn had him right where he wanted him, but Alexander wasn't going to go down without a fight. He would get that package, he would play Rathburn's game, but he would find a way to turn the tables. He had to, because now, it wasn't just about finding Evan. It was about bringing Rathburn down, once and for all. The sleek black sedan cruised through the city streets, blending into the rush of evening traffic. Alexander Hale's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with the events of the previous night. Rathburn's words echoed in his ears like a sinister refrain, each one a reminder of the perilous game he had been dragged into. He had agreed to Rathburn's terms, agreed to intercept a mysterious package in exchange for his son's safety. But the deal weighed heavily on him. Every instinct screamed that he was walking into a trap, that Rathburn was playing him like a pawn on a chessboard. Yet, despite the risks, Alexander couldn't afford to back out. Evan's life was on the line, and he would go to any lengths to save him. The details of the package's arrival had come through earlier that day. Sent via an encrypted message on a burner phone, Rathburn had slipped into his pocket before disappearing into the shadows. The instructions were precise, leaving no room for error. The package was scheduled to arrive at a private airstrip on the outskirts of the city at midnight, under the cover of darkness. Alexander was to intercept it before it could reach its intended destination. A task easier said than done, considering the airstrip's tight security. As Alexander approached the turnoff for the airstrip, the city lights gave way to darkness, the roads becoming narrower and less traveled. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that settled in your gut and warned you that danger was just around the corner. He pulled over a mile from the airstrip, parking the car in a secluded spot off the main road. From here, he would go on foot, using the surrounding forest to stay out of sight. The air was cold, biting against his skin as he stepped out of the car and began making his way through the trees, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. The airstrip came into view, its lights casting a harsh glow against the night sky. Alexander crouched behind a line of trees, surveying the area. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical, while a small group of men stood near the hangar, waiting. He couldn't see the package yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it arrived. Alexander's mind worked quickly, assessing his options. He needed to get close enough to the hangar to intercept the package without alerting the guards, but the area was too exposed. He would have to wait for the right moment, for a distraction or a lapse in their vigilance. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, in the distance, he heard it, a low rumble, growing louder with each passing second. A plane. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of engines cut through the night. The package was coming. He pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, hidden in the shadows, as the plane descended toward the airstrip. It was a small jet, sleek and unmarked, landing with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. The guards snapped to attention, their eyes scanning the surroundings as the plane taxied toward the hangar. The door of the jet opened, and 2 figures emerged, each carrying a metal briefcase. Alexander strained to get a better look, his instincts flaring. These men were professionals, no-nonsense types who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat. But they weren't who he was focused on. It was the briefcases, the contents of which could hold the key to everything. The guards converged around the men, exchanging a few curt words before leading them toward the hangar. This was Alexander's chance. He had to move fast, before the package was secured inside. He scanned the area, looking for a way to approach without being seen. A fuel truck was parked near the hangar, its large bulk casting a shadow over the tarmac. It was his best shot. Keeping low, Alexander made his way through the trees, using the cover of darkness to stay hidden. He moved quickly, his heart hammering in his chest as he closed the distance between himself and the truck. Once he reached it, he crouched behind the vehicle, peering around the edge to get a better view. The men with the briefcases were nearly at the hangar, the guards flanking them on either side. Alexander could feel the pressure mounting. He needed to create a diversion, something that would draw their attention away from the hangar for just a few seconds, long enough for him to grab the package and disappear into the night. His eyes fell on the fuel truck's tank, an idea forming in his mind. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only option he had. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, compact knife. With quick, precise movements, he punctured the tank, letting the fuel begin to spill onto the tarmac. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and acrid. He then pulled out a lighter, the flicker of the flame dancing in the darkness. He hesitated for just a moment, knowing that what he was about to do could go wrong in 1,000 ways. But he had no choice. He needed that package, and this was his only shot. With a deep breath, Alexander lit a piece of cloth and tossed it toward the growing pool of fuel. The flames caught instantly, a small fire quickly turning into a raging blaze as the fuel ignited. The heat surged, and within seconds, the entire area was bathed in an orange glow. The guards reacted immediately, shouts ringing out as they rushed toward the fire, their attention diverted from the briefcases. The men with the package hesitated, unsure of what to do, and that was the moment Alexander seized. He sprinted from behind the truck, moving with the speed and precision of a man who had spent years navigating the dangerous underbelly of the city. The flames roared behind him, the heat searing against his skin as he closed in on the briefcases. The men turned, eyes widening in surprise, but it was too late. Alexander was on them in a flash, his fists flying as he took down the first man with a well-placed blow to the jaw. The second man reached for his gun, but Alexander was faster, disarming him with a swift kick and sending him crashing to the ground. The guards were still distracted by the fire, their backs turned as Alexander grabbed the briefcases and bolted for the trees. He didn't stop to check if he was being followed. He didn't have time. All that mattered was getting away with the package. He ran through the forest, the briefcases heavy in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind him, shouts, the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. But he didn't dare look back. He pushed himself harder, his muscles burning with the effort as he put as much distance between himself and the airstrip as possible. After what felt like an eternity, he reached his car, stashed in the darkness of the woods. He threw the briefcases into the back seat, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he climbed into the driver's seat. Without hesitation, he started the engine and tore down the dirt road, the trees blurring past as he sped away from the airstrip. He didn't slow down until he was miles away, the airstrip far behind him, the city lights coming back into view. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. He had the package. Now, all he had to do was deliver it to Rathburn and get his son back. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a new feeling crept in, dread. Rathburn was a man of his word, but he was also a man of secrets, a master of deception. Even with the package in hand, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking straight into another trap. He pulled over at a deserted stretch of road, his hands trembling as he reached into the back seat and grabbed one of the briefcases. He had to know what was inside, had to understand what he was dealing with before he made his next move. He placed the briefcase on the passenger seat, his heart pounding as he flipped open the latches. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing the contents inside. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he stared at what lay before him. Inside the briefcase was a collection of documents, blueprints, photographs, and a thick, sealed envelope with a name scrawled across it in bold, black letters. Evan Hale. Alexander's vision blurred, a wave of nausea washing over him as he reached for the envelope with shaking hands. He ripped it open, the paper trembling as he pulled out the letter inside. His eyes scanned the words, each one driving a stake deeper into his heart. Alexander, if you're reading this, it means you've come further than I anticipated. You've proven your worth, your determination, but you've also proven your desperation. This is the part where you make a choice that will determine the fate of not only your son, but the lives of countless others. Evan's life is in your hands, but so is the key to something much bigger. By now, you've seen the blueprints, the photographs. You know what this is about. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice to save him? Bring the package to me, as agreed. But remember, every action has a consequence, and the consequences of your next move will ripple far beyond what you can imagine. Welcome to the endgame. Hail, Rathburn. Alexander's hand clenched around the letter, crumpling the paper as the full weight of Rathburn's plan hit him. This wasn't just about Evan. This was about something far more sinister, something that had the potential to destroy everything Alexander had fought to protect. He glanced at the blueprints, at the photographs of unfamiliar faces, and felt the walls closing in around him. Rathburn had set the stage for a confrontation that would force Alexander to choose between his son and the world as he knew it. The car was silent, the only sound the ragged breath that escaped Alexander's lips. He had the package, but at what cost? And as he stared down at the briefcase, the realization struck him like a blow. Rathburn wasn't just after power or revenge. He was after something much more dangerous, something that could change the world forever. And now, Alexander was the only one standing in his way. The city loomed ahead, its lights a distant blur as Alexander Hale drove through the darkened streets, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The briefcase sat ominously on the passenger seat, its contents now known to him, but the weight of its implications heavier than anything he had ever carried. Rathbun's letter replayed in his mind over and over, the words taunting him, reminding him of the impossible choice that lay ahead. He had been prepared for a dangerous mission, for deceit and treachery, but not for this. Not for a decision that could change the fate of not just his son, but countless others. The blueprints, the photographs, and the letter all pointed to one undeniable fact. Rathbun's plan was far-reaching, sinister, and would leave devastation in its wake. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he navigated the streets, his destination unknown. He was driving on autopilot, his thoughts tangled in the web Rathbun had woven around him. What had started as a desperate search for his missing son had spiraled into something much darker, a conspiracy that threatened to engulf him and everyone he cared about. He needed time to think, to process what he had learned. But time was a luxury he didn't have. The clock was ticking and Rathbun was waiting, expecting Alexander to deliver the package that could trigger the final stages of his twisted plan. Evan's name on the envelope had been a gut punch, a reminder of what was at stake. But as Alexander stared at the blueprints again, the realization set in that this wasn't just about saving one life. Rathbun was playing a larger game, and Alexander was the pawn being forced to move toward a checkmate that could destroy everything. His thoughts raced as he considered his options. He could hand over the package to Rathbun, secure Evan's safety, and walk away, knowing full well that by doing so, he'd be enabling a catastrophe. Or he could refuse, try to outmaneuver Rathbun, and risk losing his son forever. The choice was brutal, and there was no clear path forward. Alexander knew he needed help, but who could he trust? The authorities were out of the question. Rathbun had too many connections, too much power in the shadows. Anyone else would be a liability, someone Rathbun could exploit to tighten the noose around Alexander's neck. As he drove, Alexander's mind flashed to Nathan, the boy at the orphanage who had unknowingly set this chain of events in motion. There was something about the boy, something more than just the toy car that had belonged to Evan. Rathbun's cryptic hints suggested that Nathan was a piece of the puzzle too, a connection that Alexander had yet to fully understand. Suddenly, an idea began to form in Alexander's mind. If he couldn't fight Rathbun head-on, he could at least try to level the playing field. He needed leverage, something to force Rathbun's hand. And maybe, just maybe, the key to that leverage lay with Nathan. Alexander's pulse quickened as he changed direction, the decision made. He would return to the orphanage, talk to Nathan again, and find out what the boy knew, what Rathbun had been so careful to keep hidden. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had left. The streets grew quieter as he approached the orphanage, the city's pulse fading into the background. He parked the car a block away, the engine cutting out with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed the briefcase, not willing to leave it behind, and stepped out into the cool night air. St. Margaret's Orphanage stood dark and silent, its old brick facade casting long shadows under the moonlight. Alexander approached the gate cautiously, his senses on high alert. He had no idea what he would find inside, but he had to try. He owed it to Evan, to both Evan and Nathan, to see this through. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. He moved quickly, slipping through the courtyard and toward the main building. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open easily. Inside, the orphanage was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. Alexander moved through the dimly lit hallways, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. He made his way to the common room, the place where he had first seen Nathan, hoping the boy might still be awake. He pushed open the door to the common room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The room was empty, the toys and books scattered across the floor, remnants of the day's activities. But there, in the corner, was the small, familiar figure of Nathan, curled up on a threadbare couch, fast asleep. Alexander hesitated, watching the boy's peaceful form. He looked so innocent, so fragile, a stark contrast to the storm that was raging around them. But he knew he couldn't afford to wait. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He approached slowly, careful not to startle the boy. Kneeling beside the couch, he gently shook Nathan's shoulder. The boy stirred, blinking sleepily before his eyes focused on Alexander. For a moment, there was confusion in Nathan's gaze, but then recognition set in, and he sat up, clutching the toy car that had never left his side. "Mr. Hale?" Nathan's voice was small, laced with sleep. "I'm sorry to wake you, Nathan," Alexander said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "But I need to talk to you. It's important." Nathan rubbed his eyes, the confusion still evident on his face. "What's wrong?" Alexander glanced around, making sure they were alone before he continued. "Do you remember the man who told you not to talk about where you came from? The one you were afraid of?" Nathan nodded slowly, his grip tightening on the toy car. "Do you remember anything else about him?" Alexander pressed, his tone urgent but gentle. "Anything at all?" Nathan's brow furrowed as he thought hard, trying to recall memories he had likely pushed away. He was mean. He hurt people. And he told me to never say anything about where I used to live. Did he ever mention a name? Did he say anything about why he was keeping you there?" Alexander's heart raced as he waited for the boy's answer. Nathan shook his head, his eyes welling up with tears. "No, but he had a scar. A big one, just like you said." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Vaughn. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. Before Alexander could ask another question, a loud creak echoed from the hallway, a sound that didn't belong in the silence of the night. He tensed, his instincts flaring. Someone else was here. He turned toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, he heard it, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked, followed by a low, menacing voice that sent a chill down his spine. "Step away from the boy, Hale. This isn't your fight anymore." Alexander's blood ran cold as he slowly raised his hands, his heart sinking as he realized the trap had been sprung. Alexander froze, his hands raised in the air, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The voice that had spoken was chillingly familiar, the cold edge of it cutting through the darkness like a knife. He didn't need to turn around to know who was standing behind him. "Rathburn," Alexander breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. The name tasted bitter on his tongue, a reminder of the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. "Smart as ever," Rathburn replied smoothly, stepping into the room. The faint glow of the hallway light caught the barrel of the gun he was holding, the metal glinting ominously as he aimed it directly at Alexander. "But I'm afraid you've overplayed your hand this time, Hale." Alexander's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the options were few. He was unarmed, with Nathan close beside him, too close to risk any sudden movements. Rathburn had him cornered, and they both knew it. Nathan's small hand clutched at Alexander's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Hale, what's happening?" "It's okay, Nathan," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the terror gnawing at him. He had to protect the boy, had to keep him safe. "Everything's going to be okay." Rathburn's laugh was low and mocking. "Is that what you're telling yourself now, Hale? That you can still salvage this mess?" He took another step forward, his gaze flicking between Alexander and the boy. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, and now it's time to cut you out." Alexander forced himself to stay calm, to think clearly despite the panic rising inside him. Rathburn was a master manipulator, a man who thrived on control. If Alexander was going to get out of this alive, he needed to find a way to turn the tables, even if the odds were stacked against him. "What do you want, Rathburn?" Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You already have the package. You have all the leverage. What more could you possibly need?" Rathburn tilted his head, considering the question for a moment. "I suppose you could say I want to tie up loose ends," he replied, his tone casual. "You've proven to be quite the nuisance, Hale, digging where you shouldn't, asking questions that should have stayed buried. I can't have someone like you running around, thinking you can disrupt my plans." Alexander's mind worked furiously. Rathburn was here, armed, and in control. But that meant he wasn't relying on anyone else. He had come to deal with Alexander personally, which suggested that Rathburn might not have as much support as he wanted Alexander to believe. That was a sliver of hope, something he could use. "You're going to kill me then?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully neutral. And the boy too? That's your plan? Rathburn's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Nathan was never supposed to be part of this, just like your son wasn't. But you had to go and get involved, didn't you? Had to start pulling on threads that would have been better left alone. Alexander's heart twisted at the mention of Evan. Where is he, Rathburn? What did you do with my son? Rathburn's expression hardened, his grip tightening on the gun. Evan is safe, for now, but his future depends on what you do next. You've put yourself in a very precarious position, Hale. You forced my hand. Alexander knew that Rathburn was playing him, trying to keep him off balance, but he couldn't let the man see how much he had rattled him. He needed to buy time, to find a way to turn the situation to his advantage. Tell me something, Rathburn, Alexander said, his voice calm, deliberate. If you're so powerful, so in control, why are you here? Why didn't you send someone else to deal with me? Rathburn's eyes narrowed, the question clearly hitting a nerve. I don't trust anyone else to finish this job. You're a slippery one, Hale. I've seen how you operate. Always finding a way out, always surviving. But not this time. Then you should know, Alexander continued, his mind racing, that if you kill me, you'll never find out what I know. You think I've been chasing you, but I've been gathering information too. Information that could bring your entire operation crashing down. Rathburn's grip on the gun tightened, but he didn't pull the trigger. Alexander could see the gears turning in his mind, the calculations being made. Rathburn was ruthless, but he wasn't reckless. He wouldn't shoot without weighing the consequences. I could kill you right now, Rathburn said, his voice low and dangerous, and take my chances with whatever you think you've uncovered. But you won't, Alexander countered, his voice steady, because you're smarter than that. You know that killing me now would leave too many questions, too many loose ends. And if there's one thing you hate, it's loose ends. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence stretching as Rathburn weighed his options. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest, every second that passed feeling like an eternity. He had to keep Rathburn talking, had to keep him from pulling the trigger. What do you want, Hale? Rathburn finally asked, his tone betraying the slightest hint of uncertainty. Alexander's mind raced, searching for the right words. He needed to offer something that would keep him and Nathan alive, something that Rathburn couldn't afford to ignore. I want my son back, Alexander said, his voice unwavering. I want Evan safe, and I want him out of your hands. In return, I'll give you what you want. Whatever it is you're after, I'll make sure you get it. But Evan comes first. Rathburn's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in his gaze. And what makes you think you're in any position to negotiate? Because you need me, Alexander replied, the words coming out more confidently than he felt. You need me alive to finish whatever it is you've started. I'm the only one who can get you what you want without everything falling apart. For a long moment, Rathburn said nothing, his gaze locked on Alexander's. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun, though his grip remained firm. Fine, Rathburn said, his voice cold and calculated. I'll give you a chance, Hale, but understand this. If you fail, if you even think about betraying me, Evan will suffer the consequences. And so will you. Alexander nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and dread. He had bought himself some time, but at what cost? Rathburn had agreed to his terms, but Alexander knew the man would be watching his every move, waiting for the first sign of weakness. As Rathburn stepped back into the shadows, his presence a lingering threat, Alexander felt Nathan's small hand tighten around his arm. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but Alexander forced a reassuring smile. It's going to be okay, Nathan, Alexander whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for the boy or for himself. We're going to get through this. I promise. But deep down, Alexander knew that the noose was tightening, and the final showdown with Rathburn was coming. And when it did, there would be no room for mistakes. The night air was thick with tension as Alexander Hale stood outside the orphanage, Nathan's small hand still clutching his. The encounter with Rathburn had left him shaken, his mind racing with possibilities and the ever-present fear of what might happen next. Rathburn had given him a chance, one final opportunity to secure Evan's safety, but the cost was high. and failure was not an option. Alexander's gaze drifted to Nathan, who looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. The boy was too young to fully grasp the danger they were in, but he understood enough to be terrified. Alexander's heart ached for him, for the innocence that had been shattered by forces beyond his control. And yet, despite everything, Nathan had survived. There was a strength in the boy that Alexander couldn't ignore, a resilience that mirrored his own. But as much as he wanted to protect Nathan, Alexander knew that time was running out. Rathburn had made it clear that the clock was ticking, and Alexander had to act quickly if he was going to save his son. "Come on, Nathan," Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to leave. It's not safe here." Nathan nodded, his grip tightening as Alexander led him away from the orphanage and toward the car. The city around them was quiet, the streets deserted in the late hours of the night. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant sound a potential danger. But Alexander pushed those fears aside, focusing on the task at hand. They reached the car, and Alexander helped Nathan into the passenger seat before climbing behind the wheel. The briefcase was still on the seat, a constant reminder of the perilous situation they were in. Alexander glanced at it, then at Nathan, and made a decision. "I need to show you something, Nathan," he said, his tone serious. "It's important." Nathan looked up at him, curiosity mixing with fear. "What is it?" Alexander took a deep breath and opened the briefcase, revealing the documents inside. He pulled out the blueprints, spreading them across the dashboard where Nathan could see them. The intricate designs, the schematics for something far more dangerous than Nathan could understand, filled the small space with a sense of foreboding. "These are plans for something bad," Alexander explained, choosing his words carefully, "something that could hurt a lot of people. And the man who has your friend Evan, he's behind it. I need to stop him, Nathan, but I can't do it alone." Nathan stared at the blueprints, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you need me to do?" Alexander hesitated. What he was about to ask was risky, dangerous even, but he saw no other way. Nathan was the key, the link that connected all of this back to Rathburn. Whatever secrets the boy held, they were the last pieces of the puzzle. "I need you to remember," Alexander said softly. "Remember anything you can about the man who took you, about where you were kept. Anything that might help me find him." Nathan's face twisted with fear, but he nodded slowly. "I'll try." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're brave, Nathan. I know this is scary, but you're not alone. I'm here, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe." Nathan took a deep breath, then began to speak. His words were halting at first, as if he was pulling them from some dark corner of his memory, but as he talked, the details started to flow. He described the man with the scar, the cold, empty room where he was kept, the faint sounds of machinery in the distance, and the small window that looked out onto a courtyard. As Nathan spoke, Alexander's mind began to piece together the fragments of information. The machinery, the courtyard. These were clues, breadcrumbs that could lead him to where Rathburn was hiding Evan. But there was something else, something Nathan said that struck a chord deep within Alexander. "He used to talk to someone," Nathan murmured, his eyes distant as he recalled the memories. "On a phone, I think. He would say things like the boss and the project. And once he mentioned a name. I think it was something like the Cross." Alexander's blood ran cold. The Cross. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a code name for a covert operation he had once been involved in, a project that had been buried deep, its existence known only to a select few. If Rathburn was invoking that name, it meant the stakes were even higher than Alexander had realized. Rathburn wasn't just executing a plan. He was reviving a nightmare. The Cross had been a blueprint for disaster, a project designed to manipulate and control. It had been shut down before it could be fully realized. But Rathburn had clearly kept the plans, and now he intended to see them through. Alexander's heart raced as the full scope of Rathburn's plan became clear. The package he had intercepted, the blueprints, the connection to Nathan and Evan. It was all part of a larger scheme, one that could devastate countless lives if Rathburn succeeded. But now, Alexander had a new weapon in his arsenal. Nathan's memories, the information he had just provided, were the key to locating Rathburn's hideout and stopping the plan before it could be executed. It was a long shot, but it was all Alexander had. He looked at Nathan, his resolve hardening. "You've helped more than you know, Nathan. Now it's my turn to make sure this ends." Nathan nodded, his trust in Alexander unwavering. "What are we going to do?" Alexander glanced at the briefcase, the blueprints, and then at the road ahead. "We're going to find Evan," he said, his voice filled with determination. "And we're going to stop Rathburn. But first, we need to go somewhere safe. I need to make a call." As he started the engine, Alexander's mind was already working on the next steps. He would use the information Nathan had given him to track down Rathburn's location, to find where Evan was being held. And once he did, he would strike. Quickly, decisively, before Rathburn could put his plan into motion. The car roared to life, and Alexander drove into the night. The city lights a blur as they sped away. The final confrontation was coming, and Alexander knew that the outcome would determine the fate of everyone involved. The stakes had never been higher, but Alexander was ready. He had lost too much, sacrificed too much, to let Rathburn win. And with Nathan by his side, he had a chance, one last chance, to set things right. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.